June 1942, near the front, southern USSR. The first time a German sentry heard them, he thought it was the wind. It was a strange sound, a soft whooshing in the black sky above the trenches, barely louder than dry leaves scraping across a roof. No engine roar, no familiar drone of a bomber or fighter, just a gliding whisper that did not belong on a battlefield. Then the bombs started falling. They were small, by the standards of war, sometimes just 50 kilograms each, but they came in clusters, dropping onto ammunition dumps, fuel depots, crossroads, where trucks were parked nose to tail, or even just on a dugout, where a company tried to snatch a few hours of sleep. Explosions ripped through the night, canvas tents shredded, wooden huts splintered. German soldiers stumbled from their bunks into the open, some without boots, eyes wild, unable to see what was killing them. They looked up, blinking into darkness. For a moment, they saw nothing. Then, just before the planes banked away, someone caught a glimpse of them, tiny biplanes silhouetted against a pale sliver of moon. 2 wings, open cockpits, no lights, just shadows. Nachthexen, one soldier muttered later in the bunker, voice shaking. Night Witches. The name stuck. Months before the Germans named them witches, the Soviet women who would earn that title were just volunteers standing in the cold, waiting to see if anyone would take them seriously. Marina Raskova, famous aviatrix and national hero, had fought hard to get them there. Before the war, she'd been part of record-breaking flights across the Soviet Union, her face printed on posters and newspapers, her name spoken with pride. When Germany invaded on June 22, 1941, she received letters from young women all over the country. We want to fight. We can fly. Let us go to the front. But aviation schools, regiments, and commanders told them the same thing. We have no place for women in combat units. Raskova refused to accept that. She went directly to Joseph Stalin, arguing that the Soviet Union could not afford to ignore willing, trained pilots while the Luftwaffe bombed their cities and tank columns rolled over their fields. Whatever he truly thought of women in combat, Stalin understood numbers. He signed the order. 3 all-female aviation regiments were formed, a fighter regiment, a dive bomber regiment, and a night bomber regiment that would become legendary, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They would be entirely female, pilots, navigators, ground crew, mechanics, armorers, even support staff. They would be given the worst planes left in the inventory, and they would be sent straight into war. When they arrived at their new base, little more than a rough airstrip with sheds and tents, the women expected yak fighters, twin-engined bombers, something modern and powerful. Instead, parked along the edge of the field, waited rows of small, fragile-looking biplanes, wooden frames, fabric-covered wings, open cockpits, fixed landing gear, the Polikarpov Po-2. In peacetime, these planes had been used as crop dusters, trainers, and utility aircraft. Their top speed was barely enough to tempt a strong headwind. Their nickname among male pilots was a joke, the sewing machine, because of the rattling sound of its little radial engine. Now, someone had bolted bomb racks to the wings and told the women, "These are yours." Some laughed under their breath, some felt insulted, but Major Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the commander of the regiment, a compact, tough woman with eyes like polished steel, only nodded. "They're slow," she said, running a gloved hand along a wing spar. "But they can fly from fields the big bombers cannot. They're simple. They're forgiving. They are what we have." She looked at the row of aircraft, then at the young faces in front of her. Many barely 20, some even younger, all determined. "We will learn what we can do with them," she said, "and then the Germans will learn too." In the 588th, each Po-2 had a 2-woman crew, pilot in the rear cockpit, navigator, bomb aimer in the front. The women came from different backgrounds. Some had flown in aero clubs before the war, used to gliders and small trainers. Others had trained as civilian pilots or parachute instructors. A few had hardly seen a cockpit before arriving, but they learned fast. They were given men's uniforms, too big, too heavy, boots stuffed with cloth to fit, belts cut down, flight goggles that fogged easily. There weren't enough proper leather flight jackets. So many flew in layers of whatever they could find. Cold would become their third crew member. There was no heating in the open cockpits. At night, in high-altitude air over the steppe, temperatures could drop low enough to freeze exposed skin in minutes. Hands numbed on the controls. Faces burned from icy wind. Sometimes the tears streaming from their eyes would freeze at the corners, but they kept flying. Training for night bombing in clumsy biplanes was both terrifying and strangely intimate. They flew low over dark fields, learning how to read the faint outlines of rivers, tree lines and villages by moonlight and starlight. Compasses spun crazily near frontline radio stations. Maps were often outdated or incomplete, and landmarks could be ruined or burning. The navigator, hunched in the front cockpit with a map board and stopwatch, had to track every turn, every change in speed, every landmark glimpsed through gaps in cloud. 90 seconds from the river bend to the railway line, an instructor would warn. If you miss it, you'll bomb the wrong town. Mistakes were unforgiving. The pilot, in the back, had to fly by feel as much as by instrument. The Po-2's engine would cough and vibrate if mistreated. The slow stall speed was a blessing, but in darkness, misjudging altitude by a few meters could mean clipped trees or a wing torn off by an unseen telephone pole. They practiced cutting the engine and gliding. Engine on, approach, engine off, glide in silence. Engine back on only after the bombs were gone and the plane had banked away. At first, the instructors considered it just another trick to make them harder to hit. None of them yet understood that this quiet, drifting approach would become the sound that gave them their name. The regiment's first combat missions came in 1942, supporting Soviet ground forces trying desperately to slow the German advance in the south. Their orders were simple on paper: harass enemy positions at night, destroy supplies, disrupt sleep, make them fear the dark. The reality was brutal. On their first night operation, a small group of Po-2s took off one by one from a rough field. Dawn was still hours away. The air smelled of damp earth and exhaust. Mechanics ran alongside each plane as it moved, making last-second checks, then stepped back, raising gloved hands in farewell. One pilot, Nadia, 20 years old, her hair pinned tightly under her helmet, felt her stomach twist as the tail lifted and the field dropped away beneath her. In the front cockpit, her navigator, Tanya, tapped her shoulder and pointed toward a distant glow on the horizon. That was their target, a German supply area where trucks, ammo dumps, and barracks clustered near a rail spur. They flew low to avoid radar and searchlights, the engine buzzing like an angry insect in the night. Anti-aircraft guns around the target were meant for faster, higher bombers. The Po-2s fell beneath their ideal engagement envelopes. Still, the Germans fired. Tracer rounds clawed at the sky. Nadia's hands tightened on the controls. "Closer!" Tanya shouted over the intercom tube, voice whipping back with the wind. "We must see the line of trucks. There!" A row of darker shapes against the glow of fires and lanterns. Nadia leveled the wings. Tanya watched the ground slide beneath them, counting seconds under her breath. At the right moment, she yanked the release. Bombs fell like dark seeds. Nadia banked sharply, opening the throttle. The Po-2 clawed for altitude, while the ground below erupted in flashes of orange. For a brief moment, they saw trucks flipped like toys, figures running, someone firing up at them in wild defiance. They lived to land again. Not everyone did. Another crew flew too low. A burst of machine gun fire shredded their wing. Their plane rolled, hit a stand of trees, and vanished in flame. The surviving crews saw the fire from a distance and knew what it meant. Back at the airstrip, Bershanskaya read the report, her face impassive. Then she walked to the line of returning aircraft and watched each woman climb down, legs shaking from cold and adrenaline. "You did your work," she said. "Tomorrow night, you will do more." There was no time for grief. Not yet. The regiment was building something, not just a combat record, but a reputation. At first, the Germans treated the night biplanes as an annoyance. Slow, old, ridiculous. But after weeks of raids, then months, their view changed. Whenever the Soviet front in a sector stiffened, whenever German troops dug in, whenever they tried to sleep between battles, the bombs came. Not heavy like from Heinkel or P-2 bombers. Not enough to flatten an entire position in one strike, but precise enough to hit a fuel truck, a field kitchen, a headquarters hut. Enough to keep everyone awake. Every night. Again and again. German soldiers noticed that the planes almost always came in pairs or small groups. They noticed that the engines cut off just before the attack run. They noticed that, in the silence before the bombs fell, the only sound from the sky was a faint, eerie rushing, like someone sweeping the air with a broom. "Sie kommen wieder, die Nachthexen." They're coming again, the Night Witches. Some swore that the witches could see in the dark. Others insisted they had been promised extra leave if they shot one down. The fear was real, even if the stories grew wild in the telling. Down on the Soviet side of the lines, the women of the 588th didn't think of themselves as witches. They thought of themselves as aviators trying to survive another mission, in planes older than many of the pilots flying them. But word of the nickname reached them eventually. Some were amused, some were angry, others simply shrugged. "If they want to call us witches," one pilot said, tightening her scarf before climbing into her Po-2. "Let them. Witches know how to fly at night." She tapped the fabric wing. "And we still have a lot more nights to visit them." That was only the beginning. The real legend of the Night Witches would be written not in one raid or 1 month, but in thousands of sorties, in freezing cockpits, in bomb racks reloaded by numb fingers, in silent glides over sleeping troops who would soon learn to dread the sound of brooms in the dark. By the end of 1942, the novelty had worn off. Whatever curiosity or skepticism the women of the 588th had inspired at the start had been ground down by repetition, mission after mission, night after night, until the routine of flying into blackness with bombs under their wings became as familiar as breathing. Familiar, but never safe. The day belonged to other units, to the big bombers, to the fighters, to the artillery batteries trading thunder with German guns. The women worked when the sun vanished. Their day began at dusk. Engines were checked, patched, coaxed to life. Ground crews, also women, worked with hands already raw from cold and fuel, tightening bolts, inspecting control cables by lamplight. Armourers wrestled bombs out of trucks, rolling them on wooden rails and muscling them under the thin wings. There were no fancy bomb lifts or mechanized trolleys, just backs and arms and willpower. The pilots and navigators gathered around a map board, breath clouds hanging in the tent. Tonight, the targets might be a battery of 88mm guns that had harassed Soviet lines all day, a crossroads where German trucks piled up under camouflage nets, a headquarters building in a village a few kilometers behind the front. Sometimes the target was as vague as a grid square marked, "Enemy reserves. Disturb. Do not let them rest." Major Bershanskaya's briefings were short and to the point. She traced lines across the map with a gloved finger, marking approach routes. "You will fly in pairs or threes," she said. "Never alone unless ordered. First wave marks the target with a flare or the first bombs. Second wave follows the fires. No lights on the aircraft. Maintain radio silence unless in danger." She looked up at the ring of faces, catching each woman's eyes. "If you get lost, follow the river home. If you are hit and must land, try to do it on our side. If you cannot—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. They all knew what it meant to fall into German hands as female combatants. One mission was never just one mission. On a good night, a crew might fly 6, 8, 10 sorties, take off, bomb, return, refuel, rearm, and go again before the eastern horizon even thought about brightening. After the first sortie, when the adrenaline faded, exhaustion settled into bones. Fingers cramped from gripping the control stick, from clutching map and pencil, from pulling bomb release levers. But there was no time to be tired. Mechanics swarmed the Po-2 as soon as it rolled to a stop. Someone checked the engine for new rattles. Someone else dragged bombs into position. A girl with grease up to her elbows inspected the landing gear for cracks. The pilot and navigator climbed down, legs numb, cheeks raw from the wind. A mug of something hot, tea if they were lucky, boiled water if they weren't, was pressed into their hands. "How was it?" a mechanic would ask. "Hot," the pilot might say. "Flak thicker tonight. They're learning." "And the Germans?" someone else would ask. "They're still awake," the navigator would answer. "Let's go remind them again." It was Nadezhda Popova, one of the regiment's most famous pilots, who later explained how their signature attack run evolved into an art. "On the way to the target," she said, "we flew low, sometimes just above the treetops, skimming the ground, so their radar wouldn't see us. If there was no moon, we flew by feeling the darkness on our faces. Near the target they climbed, just enough to give the bombs some fall. Then, at a prearranged point, the pilot would pull the throttle back. The engine coughed, then settled into a bare idle or stopped completely. Suddenly, the roar vanished. The plane became a glider, a shadow on 2 canvas wings, sliding through the night. In that silence, the crew heard only wind in the bracing wires, the creak of stressed wood, the soft tick of cooling metal. The ground below was a dark, shifting shape. Ahead, pinpricks of light, lanterns, cigarettes, vehicle headlights, muzzle flashes. German soldiers below would hear it too, that strange, rushing whisper. Brooms, some of them thought, hairs rising on the backs of their necks. They fly on brooms. In the front cockpit, the navigator watched the target grow larger, counting under her breath. 3, 2, 1. Jets. She pulled the release. Bombs fell, dark against dark. The pilot banked hard, nose rising as much as the Po-2 would allow, heart hammering, praying they'd be back over friendly soil before the engine decided not to restart. Only when they were already turning away would she push the starter. Sometimes it caught on the first try, sometimes not. More than one crew lived a lifetime in those few seconds, listening to the silence and imagining searchlights stabbing up to fix them in white. The Germans did not stay passive. By 1943, in sectors where the 588th was most active, they had learned the patterns. They placed more searchlights around key positions. They stationed night fighters where they could, though the slow Po-2s were oddly hard to catch. Fast Messerschmitts often overshot them, unable to stay airborne at such low speeds. On one mission over the Cuban bridgehead, a pair of Po-2s approached a target, a German logistics hub nestled among low hills and grain fields. The lead plane cut its engine early, gliding smoothly, the navigator's hand hovering over the release lever. Then the ground lit up. Searchlights snapped on in unison, crossing beams clawing at the sky, turning darkness to glaring white in patches. One beam caught the lead Po-2 dead on, washing the fabric wings in blinding light. "Down!" the navigator yelled instinctively, as if they could duck away from a light. Tracer rounds clawed up after them, red and green lines curving through the air. The pilot jerked the stick, feeling the little biplane shudder as it banked. A round tore a fist-sized hole in the wing fabric. Another snapped a stay wire with a high, ugly ping. The aircraft skipped sideways, nearly stalling. In the second plane, just behind and to the side, the pilot saw her comrades pinned in the light like an insect. She gritted her teeth. If they're looking at them, she decided, they're not looking at us. She held her engine at a whisper, stayed in the shadows between beams, edged closer, and dropped her bombs right on the edge of the searchlight batteries. The blast knocked one light askew, sending its beams spinning drunkenly into the sky. The women never pretended it was skill alone. Sometimes it was luck, sometimes German miscalculation. But each mission like that taught them, and their enemies, that the sewing machines were harder to swat than they looked. Unlike pilots in heavy bombers with armored cockpits and multiple crew, the Night Witches flew in planes that offered almost no protection. The Po-2's advantages: it could fly very low and very slow. It could use tiny, improvised airstrips close to the front. It was simple to repair. It was difficult for fast enemy fighters to engage effectively. Its disadvantages: canvas and wood instead of metal, no armor plating, no radios in many aircraft, only signal flares and pre-briefed plans, minimal instruments, open cockpits. A burst of machine gun fire that a bomber might shrug off could rip through a Po-2 from nose to tail. When a crew was hit, there wasn't much between them and the sky except prayer and stubbornness. Pilots learned to read the plane's wounds through the controls, the mushy feeling when a control surface was damaged, the tug on one wing, the sluggish climb when the engine had taken a round. There are accounts of Night Witch pilots bringing home aircraft that looked like torn laundry on a frame, fabric shredded, struts splintered, wheels half shot off. They landed anyway. Sometimes the mechanic who met them at the strip would whistle softly, touching ragged holes with a fingertip. "The witches were busy tonight," she'd say. "Nearly burned their brooms." At the beginning, even on their own side, not everyone welcomed them. Some male commanders saw the all-female regiment as a political gesture, something for propaganda posters rather than serious war fighting. When the 588th arrived at new fronts, there were often muttered jokes, smirks, sideways glances. The women heard it all. They'll cry the first time flak hits them. "We are so short of men that we send girls now." Good for morale, maybe, not for real work. But the war did not grade by gender. It graded by results. As the sortie count climbed, hundreds, then thousands, and German positions reported regular night harassment, even in sectors thought quiet, attitudes began to change. Infantrymen sleeping in trenches, glad for any disruption of the enemy, started asking, "Are the girls flying tonight? Good. Maybe Fritz won't sleep either." Artillery officers noticed that German counter-batteries fired less accurately the morning after a particularly noisy night. Staff officers began requesting the 588th by name when drawing up fire plans. And somewhere in a dugout, a political officer decided to stop treating the unit as a curiosity and start writing them into dispatches. Through this grinding routine, some names stood out even amid a regiment of extraordinary women. Nadezhda Popova flew so many sorties that the number sounded like a misprint, reportedly over 800 missions. On one particularly brutal night, she completed 18 sorties. Take off, bomb, land, refuel, rearm, repeat, until she was so exhausted she needed help climbing down from the cockpit. Yevdokia Nosal, a navigator, became one of the regiment's first posthumous heroes of the Soviet Union. She died at her station during a mission, still guiding her pilot home, even as life slipped away. Irina Sebrova, another pilot, chalked up more than 1,000 combat hours and hundreds of sorties, earning decorations that would have made any male pilot proud. The regiment as a whole would eventually fly around 23,000 combat sorties before the war ended. The numbers were staggering, but none of the women thought of themselves as heroes while it was happening. There was always another mission, another night, another target pinned to the board in the briefing tent. One night, returning from a raid, a young pilot and her navigator misjudged their approach. Low cloud and darkness swallowed the airstrip. Their engine coughed, then sputtered out for good, fuel exhausted. They glided blind. Below them lay a patchwork of fields, trenches, shell holes, tree lines. On one side of that invisible line, their own troops. On the other, German machine guns. They picked a direction and trusted to luck. The plane hit rough ground, bounced, dug in, and collapsed into a tangle of wood and fabric. Miraculously, both women crawled out alive, bruised and bleeding, but unbroken. At dawn, infantry found them sitting on the wreck, sharing the last of a crushed chocolate bar. "You must be the witches," one soldier said, staring at them in awe. The navigator nodded, eyes rimmed with dark circles. "Who else?" she replied. They walked back to their unit and flew again the next night. The Germans still didn't know their names. They only knew that when the sky went black and the wind whispered the sound of wings and brooms, sleep would not come easily. The Night Witches were just getting started. By the winter of 1942, the Night Witches had become part of the landscape of the Eastern Front. Like mud, like cold, like the distant rumble of guns that never stopped. To German troops, they were an unwelcome superstition, made real. If the sky was clear and the moon was thin, somewhere out there, biplanes might be droning toward them, engines ready to go silent at any moment. To Soviet soldiers, they were a rumor made flesh. The girls in the little canvas planes who never seemed to sleep. To themselves, they were something simpler. They were tired. They were cold. And they still had work to do. When the snows came, the airfields turned into mud, frozen in place. The Po-2s were painted with streaks of whitewash, smeared over the green to blend in with the winter landscape. It flaked and peeled, but from a distance, under moonlight, the planes looked like ghosts. The nights grew even colder. Navigators wrapped their feet in wool and newspaper, then jammed them into boots. Pilots pulled multiple layers of sweaters under their flight jackets. Some tied scarves over their faces, leaving only slits for their eyes. Even so, at altitude, the cold sliced through. Frost formed on goggles and instrument panels. Breath turned to ice crystals that clung to hair and eyelashes. Hands that had been nimble in summer grew clumsy. One pilot joked, teeth chattering, "If the Germans don't get us, frostbite will." Her navigator rattled the bomb shackles with gloved fingers and muttered, "As long as the frostbite waits until we're done." On those long winter nights, fog and low cloud were as dangerous as any enemy. The Po-2s had almost no navigation equipment beyond compass, clock, and the navigator's experience. Once, a pair of Night Witch planes flew straight into a bank of fog that swallowed the earth and sky alike. Inside the grey, the horizon vanished. The pilot lost all sense of up and down. "Are we climbing?" she shouted. "I don't know," her navigator yelled back, clinging to the edge of the cockpit. "I can't see anything." The controls felt light, then heavy, then light again. If she pulled too hard, they'd stall and fall. If she didn't pull enough, they'd drift into the ground without ever seeing it. The Po-2, forgiving even in terror, gave them a chance. She eased the stick forward, then back, searching for a rhythm. At last, the fog thinned, and dim shapes returned. The line of trees, the faint glow of fires, the spread of snowfields below. They made the target by instinct and stubbornness, dropping their bombs more on faith than precision. When they landed, the ground crew saw two women step out of the plane with their legs shaking so badly they had to be helped away from the wings. "How was it?" someone asked. "Like flying in milk," the navigator said hoarsely. "Rotten German milk." They laughed, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was letting the terror come back. Not every sortie was explosive. Some nights, the 588th was sent not to bomb, but to guide. Their little planes, with engines that could run reliably at low speeds, made perfect pathfinders. They flew ahead of heavier bombers, marking routes with flares and smoke. They signaled changes in course. They made sure the big machines did not wander into terrain, or into friendly fire, by mistake. These missions didn't produce dramatic explosions or ruin depots the next day. They left no obvious scars on the landscape. Yet the heavy bomber crews who followed their ghostly beacons understood how much they mattered. "If we see the little biplanes," one bomber pilot said, "we know we're where we should be." Many of these support sorties never made it into official tallies. They were just marks in logbooks. Time 0320, duty, guidance, result, completed. The women didn't complain. Every successful trip meant fewer lost bombers, fewer crews who vanished into the dark. Loss, when it came, never felt fair. In the spring of 1943, during operations in the Kuban region, the 588th flew intensively, attacking German positions entrenched along the Taman Peninsula. The front had bogged down in a grim stalemate of trenches, minefields, and artillery. The regiment's planes took off in pairs, as usual. One night, two close friends, let's call them Anya and Galia, flew together. Anya in the first plane, Galia in the second, offset slightly to one side and behind. They had flown dozens of missions like this, a dance in 3 dimensions, trusting each other's instincts. The target was a cluster of enemy artillery batteries dug in along a ridge. On the approach, German flak was heavier than usual. The sky erupted with bursts of orange and white. Tracers arced upward like angry fireflies. Anya's Po-2 danced between them, engine throttled back, wings rocking slightly. She glanced over her shoulder, searching for Galia's plane. She saw it, just for a moment, silhouetted by a shell burst. Then another shell went off almost directly beside it. The shock wave slammed into both aircraft. Anya's plane lurched. She wrestled it back under control, heart pounding. When she looked for her friend again, there was nothing. No flame, no falling wreck, just empty sky full of smoke. She wanted to circle, to search, to call out on the radio, but doctrine and survival screamed at her, bomb and run, bomb and run. They completed the attack. On the way home, the darkness felt heavier than usual. Back at the airstrip, Anya's landing was rough. The wheels hit hard, bounced, then settled. She taxied to the side and cut the engine. Mechanic hands reached up to help her down, but she shoved them away, stumbling toward the spot where Galia's plane should have been. It wasn't there. Maybe she landed on another strip, someone offered weakly. Maybe her engine quit and she put down in a field. Maybe... They waited for hours, listening for the distant buzz of a Po-2. Finally, just before dawn, Bershanskaya gathered them. "The front line reported seeing a small plane hit during the raid," she said. "No parachutes. The ground there is in German hands." Silence settled over the group like a weight. Anya stared at the dirt, fists clenched. That night, the regiment flew again. Anya was among the first to volunteer. "Gallia's target is still there," she said. "Somebody has to remind them of her." From then on, the women carried their dead with them in the air, names etched in memory, faces in the corner of their minds when they lined up on targets, voices in the way the wind sounded when they cut the engine. By mid-1943, the reputation of the Night Witches had crystallized on both sides. On the German side, orders went out instructing troops to shoot down the night biplanes at all costs. Some units reportedly offered iron crosses to the first man who could bring one down. The nickname Nachthexen spread through letters home and whispered stories in dugouts. A German soldier later recalled, "You could not see them, only hear that cursed rustling above, then the explosions. You never slept well when they were in the area." On the Soviet side, the regiment's performance earned it respect all the way up the chain of command. Commanders began planning night operations, assuming they would have the 588th's support. Infantry units on the ground cheered when they heard the distinctive buzz and then silence above. "They fly on rags and plywood," one Red Army sergeant said, "but they fly for us." The regiment's successes did not shield them from hardship. They still slept in drafty huts or tents. They still flew in hand-me-down uniforms. They still patched their own planes with fabric and dope between missions, sometimes using parts cannibalized from wrecks. But when they walked to their aircraft now, fewer eyes looked at them with doubt. They were not a novelty anymore. They were a weapon. Amid the vast campaigns, named operations, shifting front lines, arrows on maps, life in the regiment still had small human rhythms. Between missions, someone found an old gramophone, and on rare, quieter nights, they played scratchy records, waltzes, folk songs, fragments of pre-war joy. A girl with a hoarse voice sang along, off-key but full-hearted. Someone kept a stray dog that had wandered onto the field one day, ribs showing. It became a sort of squadron mascot, roaming from tent to tent, soaking up warmth and scraps. Pilots wrote letters home that began with phrases like, "Don't worry about me, Mama," and lied politely about how close the front really was. Navigators drew little broomsticks in the margins of their logbooks next to particularly rough missions. One evening, the regiment's political officer pinned a new sheet of paper to the message board in the mess tent. On it was a summary of their completed sorties and confirmed effect. Ammo dumps destroyed, vehicles burned, enemy positions harassed. At the bottom, someone had scrawled in pencil, "And hours of enemy sleep stolen, too many to count." As 1943 bled into 1944, the tide of the war began, slowly, to turn. The Red Army shifted from desperate defense to grinding offense. The front moved west. The Night Witches moved with it. New bases, new fields, new targets. Same old Po-2s patched again and again. They had taken their place in the machinery of victory, but their most astonishing work, flying over newly liberated cities, crossing borders that had once felt impossibly far, and seeing Germans retreat for good, still lay ahead. For now, each night was much like the last. Cold, dark, dangerous. And somewhere in that darkness, a German sentry would cock his head, tense, and whisper to the man beside him, "They're up again. The witches are here." By 1944, the map had changed. The red arrows on staff tables no longer pointed backward in retreat or sideways in desperate counterattacks. They pointed forward, west, across rivers and borders that had once seemed fixed like mountains. The front moved, and the Night Witches moved with it, their regiment officially redesignated. The 46 Guards Taman Night Bomber Aviation Regiment carried not only a new honorific title, Guards for Exceptional Performance, Taman for their role over the Taman Peninsula, but also the weight of expectation. When an army wanted the enemy's knights broken, they asked for the witches. In the autumn of 1943, Soviet forces launched major offensives to cross the Dnieper River, one of the great natural barriers of Eastern Europe. For infantry slogging through mud and water under fire, the river felt endless. For the Night Witches, it became a dark ribbon on their maps. Dangerous, but also a precious landmark in the creatures of fog and chaos they flew through. Their task was simple to write, hard to do. Bomb German artillery and troop positions on the western bank. Hit pontoon bridges, ferries, and crossing points used by the enemy. Protect their own side's fragile bridgeheads by making it hell for any German unit ordered to counterattack at night. Night after night, the Po-2s rose from muddy strips near the river. Their wings brushed low clouds. Their wheels splashed through standing water on takeoff. Sometimes they lifted off only because the ground disappeared, not because they'd truly gained enough speed. Navigators learned the shape of the river by heart. How long from this bend to the island? What angle does the bank take after the bridge? In the dark, if you lost the thread of the land, you could fall back on the water's slow curve. German artillery units, tasked with shelling Soviet crossings, discovered that every time they dug in near the riverbank and tried to sleep between barrages, the witches came. Bombs didn't always hit the guns. Sometimes they hit the cook tents, the ammo wagons, the place where limbers and horses were parked. Men jolted awake to canvas flapping open in shock waves, and horses screaming in terror. By day, Wehrmacht officers studied the damage and swore as they filled out reports. By night, their men lay awake, listening for brooms. In 1944, the war surged out of Soviet territory into lands occupied by Germany. The regiment shifted onto fields in Belarus, then Poland, living out of tents and wooden barracks hastily thrown up near captured airstrips. These bases were barely safer than the front. Sometimes the Germans counterattacked close enough that the women could hear tank engines and gunfire as they prepared missions. As the Red Army advanced, more and more towns lay in ruins. The women saw sights that burned themselves into memory. Villages reduced to blackened stove chimneys and rubble mass graves and open pits. Places where the local population was almost gone. They read the captured German signs nailed on posts, verboten, Juden verboten, ominous warnings, to understand what had been done here before the Red Army arrived. For some, the war became personal in a new way. It was easier to take off again, one pilot later admitted. You did not have to convince yourself why you were flying. The Germans had already explained it with what they left behind. Their targets changed with the campaign. Retreating columns on roads, headlights doused, trying to slip away under cover of dark temporary field headquarters, scrambling to direct defensive lines, railway junctions where trains loaded with troops or loot clustered in the night. The Po-2s, slow as ever, could appear where bigger, faster planes could not, dropping down over narrow forest clearings, popping up along rivers, gliding low over ravines, and always the same routine: brief, load, fly, bomb, land, refuel, again. The war might be grand history from above, but from the cockpit it was a series of circles, arcs, and landings scratched into tired muscle memory. By this stage, the regiment was famous. They had flown tens of thousands of sorties. Dozens of women had been decorated for bravery. Some were awarded the highest title the Soviet Union could give, Hero of the Soviet Union. They pinned golden stars to uniforms that were still too big and smelled of fuel and smoke. For many, the medals felt heavy in ways that had nothing to do with metal. Each award carried a shadow, because for every woman called up onto a platform to receive honors, another name had already been read out quietly in the early hours. Killed in action. Did not return from mission. Presumed lost behind enemy lines. Some aircraft simply vanished in the dark, with no witnesses to see whether they fell on friendly soil or enemy ground. Sometimes wreckage would be found weeks later in a forest or in a field pocked with shell craters. The regiment mourned as they worked. There was no space for long funerals, no time for elaborate ceremonies. A small table, a photograph, if one existed, a moment's silence in the mess tent. Sometimes not even that, if the night's schedule was full. Then someone would say, "She wouldn't want us on the ground while the others are up there," and they'd go back to their planes. The logbooks did not show grief. They showed numbers, sortie counts, target codes, bomb loads. Between those lines, the story was written in things only the women knew. Which bunk stayed empty, which flight jacket hung on a peg, never claimed, which jokes no one made anymore, because the girl who used to tell them was gone. In early 1945, as Soviet forces crossed into German territory proper, the mood changed once again. This was no longer just liberation. It was retribution in the eyes of many. The Night Witches received missions deeper into enemy territory, bombing columns retreating along German roads, carts and cars jamming narrow lanes, harassing supply points inside towns untouched by bombing until then, striking at river crossings over the Oder and other final defensive lines. By now, German air defenses were frayed. Fuel shortages, shattered logistics, and the sheer weight of the Allied advance strained them to breaking. But a cornered enemy is often the most dangerous. Flak concentrated around key bridges, and road nodes was still deadly. Night fighters, though few, prowled when they could. One night, a Po-2 crew flew a mission over a small German city that had been turned into a logistics hub. From above, it looked disturbingly intact. Roofs unbroken, streets ordered, lights carefully blacked out or shaded. The women knew what that meant. Other bombers had not yet reached it. The population there had not yet tasted what the rest of Europe had endured. Their orders: disrupt, spread fear, make the rear feel the front. They flew low, dropping small bombs on rail yards, warehouses, and road junctions. Fires bloomed, crawling across wooden roofs and into stockpiles of material. As they turned away, the navigator looked down and saw people running in the streets, clusters of panicked movement under the flickering light. She did not feel triumph. She felt something more complicated, something like a strange, grim symmetry. Now, she thought, they know a little of what they brought to us. In April 1945, as Berlin itself came under assault, the 46th Guards Taman Regiment flew their final wartime missions in support of the push toward the city and its surrounding fortifications. The night sky over parts of Germany was no longer dark. It pulsed with distant artillery flashes and the glow of burning cities. Smoke from massive bombardments drifted for kilometers, making navigators' jobs even harder. Yet the Po-2s kept flying. They struck at crossroads, feeding reinforcements into the collapsing German lines, at gun positions trying to hold back Soviet armor, at pockets of resistance that refused to surrender. On one of those last missions, a pilot, a veteran now, with years of war etched into the lines of her face, looked down and saw something she had never quite expected to see in her lifetime. German troops throwing away weapons and running west, away from the oncoming Red Army and toward the distant, uncertain promise of surrender to the Allies instead. She banked the plane, lined up on a cluster of vehicles blocking a bridge, and dropped her bombs. The war for her had started with Germans advancing into her homeland. It was ending with Germans trying to escape their own. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, The women of the regiment did not celebrate immediately. At first, there was disbelief, then a strange emptiness. No target board that evening, no briefing, no oil-stained mechanic tugging at a sleeve to say, "We've patched the wing, you're good to go." No wind-up of the little radial engine struggling to life in the dark. Some stood by their planes in the twilight, as if waiting for someone to shout that it had all been a mistake, that they were needed back in the sky. Instead, orders came to stand down. There were award ceremonies, parades, official photographs. The regiment as a whole received high honors. 23 of its members, pilots and navigators, were named Heroes of the Soviet Union, an extraordinary concentration for a single unit. Men from other formations came to shake their hands, some awkwardly, some with genuine awe. "We didn't think you'd last," a tanker admitted to one pilot. She smiled, exhausted. "We didn't think any of us would," she said, "but here we are." Peace, when it came, scattered them. Some remained in aviation. Others returned to civilian life, studied, married, had children, vanished into the quiet anonymity of peacetime. A few struggled to adjust, missing the clarity of purpose the war had forced on them, even as they were glad to see it gone. For decades, the story of the Night Witches lived mostly in veteran circles, memoirs, and scattered articles. The Cold War, politics, and shifting historical fashions pushed many Eastern Front narratives into the background in Western memory, but in letters, diaries, and aging photographs, their reality remained. Two women in an open cockpit, night after night. Frost, wind, maps pinned with clothespins, a faint whoosh over a German trench line, a muttered curse in a language they didn't speak, and then silence again. The 588th 46th Guards Regiment didn't win the war alone. No single unit did. But they did something uniquely powerful. They turned old, useless planes into an instrument of relentless pressure. They showed that women in combat aviation were not a gimmick, but a force. They stole sleep, confidence, and peace of mind from an enemy that had believed itself invincible. They proved that courage in war is not a matter of gender, but of choice, one night at a time. For German troops in those years, the legend was simple. If you heard the soft rush of wings after midnight, you might wake up, you might not. For the women who flew the Po-2s, the truth was more complicated and more human. They were not monsters or myths. They were young, often scared, often freezing, often grieving, and they climbed into their flimsy biplanes anyway, again and again, until there were no more enemy nights left to raid. That's why the title is not exaggeration, but earned history. The Night Witches flew in open-cockpit biplanes, and for years they really did terrify German troops.